everyone, and thank you again for joining us today. I know it's been a while since we've had one of these sessions. So before we start, may I please ask all the participants to please mute your microphones. If you would like to ask any questions, please do so using the chat function. And as usual, we will gladly take your questions in English, in Spanish, or in Portuguese. Bueno, gracias y buenas tardes a todos. Gracias para acompañarnos de nuevo hoy. Antes de empezar, puedo pedir a todos que pongan sus micrófonos en mute. Si quiere hacer una pregunta, por favor, usen la función chat. Y como siempre, pueden hacer las preguntas en inglés, español o portugués. Además, les mandaremos el link con la grabación después de la llamada y también la copia de la presentación. Muy boa tarde a todos. Obrigado para su participación hoy. Antes de comenzar, por favor, peço a todos os participantes que coloquem seus micrófonos em modo silencioso. Se você gostaria de fazer uma pergunta, por favor, use a função da chat. Você pode fazer a pergunta em inglês, espanhol ou português. E a apresentação e a gravação serão disponibilizadas depois da chamada. Com isso, por favor, Peter, I think you're on the line. So if I could hand over to you to start with your remarks of the day.
Marcus, thank you very much. I'll start with a few opening comments, and then I'm very happy to take questions and answers. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you very much again for joining us today. As Marcus has mentioned, it's been some time since we last met. But who would have imagined that we would still be at this situation in this juncture, holding these type of conference calls because of COVID-19? It's already been almost over a year now since we've been in this crisis mode and the impacts on our industry. But COVID-19 continues to affect us all, and with the pandemic only slowly easing, it is still to be some time until we can all meet face-to-face in person once again, and we hope to do that in the short term in the coming months. The pandemic continues to play both a global and regional tragedy, and its effects can be described as cost of traffic. Allow me to take you through a brief recap of the challenges and progress. Demand has fallen through the floors, as we've mentioned many times in our global and regional gatherings. The scale of the decline completely dwarfed what happened after 9/11, the SARS outbreak, and the global financial crisis. At the end of last year, 2020, passenger demand had fallen by 66% from pre-crisis levels, figures that we last saw in 1998. And in terms of passenger revenue, we have to go all the way back to 1993. And January did not start the year any better, did not provide the hope we were hoping, either with demand down with 72% compared to the same months as in 2019. This caused deconnecting of the world. Before the crisis, on a global scale, we had over 30,000 unique international routes between airports. Now we have about 12,000. The massive loss of connectivity depressed economies worldwide, essentially shutting down international tourism, convention, exhibitions, and the likes, along with flying. In the Americas, aviation fulfills an essential role in the socio-economic development of our region, as we've mentioned many times. Unlike other continents, we don't have any viable alternative modes of transportation than air travel that can provide the essential connectivity for both people and goods. If you look here at the slide, in Latin America, we lost more than 1,000 city pairs. And although we're back at around 1,415 city pairs as of December 2020, but that's still quite short of the numbers where we were before. And unfortunately, we don't know if we will ever or when we will recover of those connections that we don't have today. The question is asked, will traffic or connectivity between Auckland, Buenos Aires, Johannesburg, Sao Paulo, or Dubai, Santiago return? These were all markets that had air service before the global crisis, the pandemic, and today airlines have announced that at least for the short and midterm, they will not be serving these markets. Ultimately, both passengers and the shipment of goods will suffer. And talking about the shipments of goods, cargo, of course, was a different story. It returned to 2019 levels by January, but Latin America is still lagging behind. What is being shipped has changed with the crisis, but people still rely on fast and efficient delivery of goods. And this is certainly true with the critical role that air cargo plays in transporting medical supplies, including vaccines. A viable air transport sector will be critical to energize the recovery. Governments realize that and have provided vital cash and other relief measures to preserve the sector during the pandemic, with direct cash infusions and through measures such as tax relief and loan guarantees. In total, it is valued at over $225 billion. Unfortunately, only a minute part of this total sum was provided by governments in Latin America, less than 1%. But as with any crisis, it should create an opportunity to reflect on the past and see what we need to improve on the future. In the short term, to drive the region's and air transport sector's recovery from COVID-19, we urge our governments to follow ICAO CART's takeoff guidance, as there are still over 30% of the countries in the Americas with either quarantine restrictions in place or policies that go against the global best practices, such as testing for crews or testing on domestic flights. And again, we're urging our governments from our region to accept electronic and globally aligned health credentials. To support these, many of you know, IATA has launched the IATA Travel Pass, together with the industry, which will allow travelers to share digital test and vaccine certificates securely with airlines and government. I am quite proud as part of the IATA team to share that we have partnered with the government of Panama and Copa Airlines to trial the IATA Travel Pass in this part of the world. Our launch customer, we also are launching other trials that you may know of, like Singapore to London, and other airlines have also launched these initiatives. We have over 18 airlines around the world that have publicly announced that they are working with IATA on the Travel Pass. And finally, we're urging our governments to create detailed restart roadmaps that will allow and specify the liftings of international travel restrictions as more citizens get vaccinated. Before I take your questions, please allow me just a few minutes to highlight per market what's going on from north to south, the key issues. I'll start with Canada. Canada has introduced some of the strictest border control measures last March and has recently even quarantine rules. We need the government to work with us to establish a roadmap on restarting both domestic and international aviation in Canada. The U.S. government has provided substantial financial support to the sector, but we need a roadmap on when travel restrictions, especially between the U.S. and Europe, will be open. In Mexico is one of the few markets which never introduced restrictions, with especially the domestic market having recovered. One of the pressing issues we have is to ensure that the government continues to engage with the industry on the planned 3-airport system for Mexico City. In the Caribbean, the Bahamian government is currently in the process of reclaiming management of its sovereign airspace from the United States and Cuba, but will retain both the FAA and ACNA, respectively, as third parties service providers of the airspace from an air traffic standpoint. The Bahamians originally intended to commence charging as of March 1st, which was then delayed to April 1st. While the industry still does not have more clarity, we are asking the Bahamian governments to further delay the implementations until such time where the Bahamas signs the service agreements with the United States and Cuba. If this is not done, the industry will be double charged, and ultimately consumers will face the consequences, and will have a more challenging environment for the Bahamas and the Caribbean to recover. In general, unfortunately, governments across the Caribbean should start avoiding implementing new taxes and charges, which will not help in stimulating demand. This is the part of the world that depends most heavily on air transportation for connectivity. In Central America, both Belize and Panama have announced that they will allow vaccinated passengers to enter the country without COVID tests or quarantines. And this is an important step in rebuilding demand and confidence amongst passengers. El Salvador announced that it will be accepting antigen tests for travel to the country, but we're still waiting for an effective date. Meanwhile, our call on authorities in Nicaragua to adopt the necessary CART protocols to reestablish air transport and rebuild its economy is still lacking. The current protocols work well for repatriation flights, but not for regular flights. And as a result, airlines have therefore deferred their restart dates until the country adapts protocols to international standards. In Colombia, a court has issued an appeal judgment revoking the lawsuits that forced the Colombian government to reinstate the PCR test requirements to enter the country. This latest decision now provides the possibility for the Minister of Health to consider lifting the testing requirements depending on infection rates in the country. However, the government's plan to install a pre-clearance facility for flights to the United States will adversely affect operations and competitiveness of Bogota Airport, both for domestic and international. IATA has reached out to the relevant governments to explain the industry's reluctance to this project. In Venezuela, the government has instructed airlines to collect, prior to boarding, effective 29th of March, $60 for PCR tests required upon arrival in the country. Authorities have also indicated that carriers that do not comply with the measures will not be able to operate. We have asked the authorities to postpone the implementation date and propose a scheme with laboratories that would collect the cost of the test, preferably through electronic forms of payment prior to arrival. Good news comes from Ecuador, as the country will be allowing vaccinated travelers to enter with no additional health formalities. In Peru, the resumption of flights of 8 hours or more will help the country reestablish its global connectivity. We are also asking the government and Lima airport partners to maintain the plan for the Lima airport expansion. Demand may be depressed at present, but once it picks up, we cannot operate using airport infrastructure that is outdated and too small. Brazil is another market which recovered very well on the domestic side and retained many of its international links. However, we're seeing a drop in domestic demand and an increasing number of countries banning arrivals from Brazil due to the prevalence of the virus mutation. Nevertheless, once the epidemiological situation improves, we expect demands to come back. Argentina, even though the country has mandated a decrease in the number of permitted inbound flights, this has been largely achieved in consultation with the industry, ensuring that demand can be satisfied and connectivity maintained. However, the increase of international passenger fees will dampen demand, especially given the fact that Argentina already has some of the highest taxes in air tickets. And finally, Chile. Vaccinations are moving quickly, with 5.9 million residents having received the first dose already. However, cases have gone up and there is public pressure not to lift restrictions. Airlines have put strict measures in place and are ready to increase operations and reconnect the world. The industry is working closely with the government to support the lifting of restrictions as vaccination rates increase further and new infections begin to decrease. And I would like, in my closing, just to look past the current COVID and the unique opportunities that our region has to reinvent itself to become more competitive. Post-crisis, we must address the region's serious shortcomings to make air transport more competitive on a global stage. Conditions of 2019 will simply be unacceptable, as governments often viewed aviation as an easy cash cow. While safely transporting passengers will always be the industry's #1 priority, governments across the region must focus on the following key pillars. The first one is investing in adequate infrastructure, both on the ground and in the air. Implementing the use of regulatory best practices to compete globally, including consistent and fair passenger right regulations. Decrease aviation-related charges and taxes, not increase them. And lead in the policy development for sustainable aviation fuels and partner with the airlines in environmental initiatives. And finally, we must work together to ensure that aviation is viewed as their business partner, supporting the social and economic development of the region and making air transport in the Americas more competitive globally. It is our hope that as we rebuild the industry, the current spirit cooperation with governments in the region will allow us for the removal of roadblocks that have in the past stifled the successful development of this sector and hindered the provisions of good passenger experience. With that, I'm very happy to take some of your questions.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Muchas gracias. Y ya vamos a pasar a las primeras preguntas, so we will go to the questions. As always, please submit them via the chat. That is the easiest for all of us. So the first question comes actually from Argentina en español. ¿Hay alguna postura de IATA respecto a un nuevo aumento de la tasa de uso aeroportuario internacional en Argentina? So this relates to the item we already had in the presentation, is the increase in international departure fee or airport use fee in Argentina.
Hasta el momento yo no tengo más información que hay un plan de incrementación de costes hacia los usuarios o a las líneas aéreas. No sé si María José está en la línea y ella ha escuchado algo nuevo, pero nosotros no hemos recibido más información, Marcus, sobre alguna posibilidad de un incremento.
Sí, tomando lo que dice Peter, es correcto. Hemos estado en reuniones y por el momento el incremento ha sido el de $6 que es oportunamente aplicado. No tenemos noticia de ninguno.
Okay, so just to sum it up in English, so we're aware of the $6 increase that has already been published, but we have no information of any further increases in the airport taxes in Argentina. But maybe MJ, you can just remind everyone, I think the tickets out of Argentina are very heavily taxed compared to other parts of Latin America or even the world.
Sí, correcto, Marcos. Ya el aumento del 6% de $6 llegó a la tasa de 51 a $57, un aumento casi del 12% y que pone a la Argentina en una de las más caras, tasas más caras, y todo el costo en sí de operar en Argentina es muy, muy elevado. Además de esto, la tasa de $57 compara con una de $2 y pico doméstica, con lo cual eso es otro de los puntos muy, muy importantes para nosotros, la no discriminación según la OASI en cuanto a tasas internacionales y domésticas.
Okay, gracias MJ. So con esto pasamos a una pregunta que viene de México. ¿Qué balance tiene la pérdida de rutas en México y Latinoamérica y además desde hace varios meses se habló en México de un probable apoyo de la Secretaría de Comunicaciones y Transportes que al parecer no se concretó. ¿Qué ocurrió en ese caso? No sé, Peter, ¿tú quieres empezar? Y si no, creo que pueda añadir alguna cosa quick. So this is basically asking about the connectivity specifically between Mexico and Latin America, and also that in the past there was talks of government support for the airlines in Mexico, and that doesn't seem to have happened up to now. Over to you, Peter.
Okay, sobre la conectividad, bueno, la conectividad poco a poco irá recuperándose. Tenemos que recordar que en muchos países a nivel regional habían restricciones de viaje, tanto a nivel cuarentena o cierre de fronteras. Así que, aunque México ha mantenido en todos momentos el país abierto tanto a los servicios de vuelos domésticos e internacionales, en los países latinoamericanos o en otros países a nivel global tenían sus fronteras cerradas, lo que no permitía los vuelos que se mantuvieran, si no eran vuelos de expatriación. Lo mismo con Estados Unidos, ahora con la implementación de pruebas antígenas o de PCR antes de volver a Estados Unidos, pues esto también ha sido un poco delimitante para una recuperación más rápida. Pero lo que sí estamos viendo es que las líneas aéreas, la conectividad internacional está volviendo con Europa, está volviendo con Norteamérica y poco a poco se irá recuperando con Sudamérica. También ha habido anuncios por algunas líneas aéreas que han anunciado incluso nuevos servicios de sus países hacia México. Así que vemos que hay una recuperación positiva en el país. El segundo, sobre el tema de apoyos financieros, bueno, al final nunca se llevaron a cabo, pero bueno, al final el gobierno sí cumplió con no cerrar o imponer restricciones a los vuelos tanto internacionales como domésticos, y eso ha permitido mantener conectividad, mantener vuelos y la confianza en los pasajeros para seguir viajando. Así que, aunque no se recibió el apoyo financiero, el gobierno sí ha optado para mantener sus fronteras abiertas, lo que sí ayuda mucho a las líneas aéreas mantener sus operaciones, y incluso en el caso doméstico, y Quid lo puede confirmar, creo que ya estamos casi al 90% de los vuelos que se operaban en el 2019 y ya se están operando ahora. Así que eso son señales positivas.
Okay, can you just do a quick summary in English? Because I know we have some on the line who don't speak Spanish. So
yeah, I'll be very quick on that. So in terms of the connectivity, the good news is Mexico never did close. It always was open, both international and domestic service. What happened while Mexico was open, you did have many countries in South America and around the world that had border restrictions or border closures. So you couldn't fly from those countries to Mexico unless they were repatriation flights. As more countries had begun to open their borders and remove restrictions, you've seen an increase of connectivity returning to better levels than it was at this point last year or in April of last year. And we will continue to see that with more flights taking part. So that we believe there's going to be a positive trend with connectivity returning back to Mexico on an international standpoint. We're already seeing very strong demand in the coastal cities, in the tourist cities like Cancun or Puerto Vallarta or Los Cabos, where there's been a heavy investment of capacity, particularly from North America. In terms of the financial support, while the government never came through in providing a commitment on the financial support to the industry like other countries, they never they did meet their promise in terms of keeping the country open for business, and that has helped the Mexican carriers both on the domestic and international side, as well as maintaining connectivity on the external side. So from our standpoint, we see that as a very positive decision from the government which has permitted the domestic service to almost return to 2019 levels, and has also permitted the international connectivity to maintain with countries in Europe, in North America, and in Latin America.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And with that, we'll remain in Mexico. I have quite a few questions in the queue on the redesigned airspace, which I believe has just gone into operation today. So I don't know if you'd like to make a few comments in English and in Spanish. And I know we also have, we have Cuitlahuac from our Mexico office, and also Jose Ruiz from our flight safety also on the line, so maybe they can chime in. Pasamos, tengo varias preguntas sobre el inicio de las operaciones en el nuevo espacio aéreo de México, y entonces, Peter, te da primero la palabra en por favor.
Vale, gracias. Bueno, empiezo aquí, después lo paso a Cuit y a José. Bueno, obviamente se ha implementado la nueva rediseño del espacio aéreo dentro de la Ciudad de México, una iniciativa que ha sido muy trabajada tanto por las autoridades como con la industria, y IATA ha jugado un rol muy involucrado trabajando conjuntamente con las líneas aéreas y con CNEAM y AFAC. Se demoró el proceso por unos meses debido a algunas inquietudes que teníamos que resolver la industria conjuntamente con el gobierno, pero bueno, en estos momentos ya estamos con una implementación, está funcionando. Tenemos que ahora ver los beneficios que nos va a traer, tanto a nivel eficiencias, menos consumo de combustible, menos consumo de CO2 y más eficiencia en todo el espacio aéreo. Así que estamos, en palabras generales, contentos. Ha sido un desarrollo complejo, porque el espacio aéreo, la área de México es una zona muy complicada a nivel transporte aéreo, y se ha hecho de una manera muy responsable, donde esperamos en breve empezar a ver los beneficios para la industria y para el sector de tránsito aéreo. No sé si José o Cui queréis comentar alguna cosa más, añadido.
José, adelante si quieres, has estado al frente de este esfuerzo también.
Vale, muchas gracias, Quit. Pues un poco complementar lo que has dicho tú, Peter. Efectivamente se retrasó unos meses la implementación. Quiero agradecer tanto a las autoridades mexicanas, tanto a FAC como CNEAM, su colaboración para que este retraso ocurriera, y recibir los inputs de la industria y de IATA. Y ahora, como bien dices, pues es el tiempo de analizar los datos que vamos a ir recibiendo, pues sobre todo para ver que esos esperados incrementos tanto en seguridad operacional como en eficacia y eficiencia pues ocurran. Y eso va a ser uno de nuestros principales ocupaciones en los próximos meses, que además es una de las prioridades que nos ha dado el Grupo de Coordinación Regional, el RCG, para la región. Así que estaremos muy atentos y empezaremos a recabar datos inmediatamente. Gracias.
Mira, ¿algo más de tu parte?
No, creo que está en mute, entonces no. Can we have a quick summary? Yes, just in English. I think it's an important topic.
Quick summary for the English speakers. Many of you may know that the industry has been working with the Mexican authorities over the last year on the redesign of the Mexican airspace. Very complex, very challenging project because of the geographic situation of the country, or the area. The implementation date was delayed by about a month, but it's now been formally implemented and restarted as of today. We have worked in a very collaborative manner with the authorities. They've taken all the feedback from the airline industry, and what we're now looking from an industry standpoint is the efficiencies that we'll be able to obtain with less fuel consumption, less CO2 emissions, and more reliability and shorter times to and from the airports. So it's while it's now in play, now we have to analyze the data to make sure that the industry and CNAM from the air traffic standpoint is actually obtaining the benefits that we were promised. I think with that, Marcus, it's about as much as we can provide at this time.
Okay, thank you, Peter and Quit and Jose for that one. That covers quite a few of the questions we had in the queue. I have some coming just from Brazil asking for...
Marcus?
Yeah.
If I could just make a notation. Just for our Mexican colleagues, and I'll say in Spanish too. Mm-hmm. This is only the first phase of the redesign initiative in Mexico. As Santa Lucia comes online, as Toluca begins to receive more traffic, and the government implements its airport structure in terms of where airlines will go, we will certainly have to adapt the redesign of the airspace to meet that increase in demand. So you will continue to hear from us and continue to hear from the authorities that we're continuing on the improvement of the airspace as the airports do come online and more aircraft or flights shift from the main airport to Santa Lucia and Toluca.
¿Quieres repetirlo en español?
Sí, en español. Yo quiero que tengamos en cuenta que la implementación de hoy es simplemente la primera fase, muchas fases que seguramente se llevarán a cabo con el rediseño. Una vez que el gobierno ya dicte cómo se va a utilizar Santa Lucía, Toluca y veamos más vuelos que se lleven a esos aeropuertos, tendremos que ir modificando lo que es el rediseño del espacio. Así que este es lo que consideramos la primera fase de un trabajo que va a durar varios años hasta que tengamos todo el sistema aeroportuario operando de una manera alineada y coordinada. Y eso obviamente a nivel de transitorio también va a requerir ese alineamiento.
No, gracias, Peter. Okay, so with this we go to Brazil. I have a few questions in the queue asking sort of our comment on the current market situation in Brazil, if we're expecting, let's say, a decline in demand, and then also if we're, with regard to the current sort of increasing cases in Brazil, if we're changing our expectations on when the Brazilian market sort of recovers, because we had, I think, said domestic sort of 2022, 2023, and then international somewhere in 23 and 24. So I don't know if you want to make a general comment on Brazil, and I believe we also have Danny, our country manager in Brazil, on the line.
So in general terms, while from a global standpoint, as Marcus has said, we've mentioned that 2024 is what we hope to return to 2019 numbers in terms of international, end of 22, beginning of 23, to domestic. It's also going to vary a lot on how quickly or how long it will take us to remove the current quarantine and country restrictions and lockdown. At this point, when we ended last year, we were hoping that the first quarter would be the start of the recovery. And obviously that has not occurred, both on a regional and global standpoint, as there's been added mutations and the vaccine has not, while we've started, but has not been carried out in the efficiency that we expected. This is causing us a delay, and that will have an impact on the delay of our industry recovery. However, in the case of Brazil, we were very lucky last year in Brazil, and throughout the year of last year, that Brazil maintained its borders open, and they had a strong domestic operation. They were able to maintain a strong domestic connectivity throughout the country, and people were traveling. What has occurred now, we're now seeing less domestic travel occurring because of the significant spike in the COVID numbers. The situation in the country is at a heightened level something that's not only concerning Brazil for Brazilians, it's concerning the entire world on what the impact can be coming out of Brazil. As a result, we've seen many countries in Latin America, North America, and in Europe impose restrictions to travelers coming from Brazil. So there's restrictions on Brazilians. The same thing in many neighboring countries throughout the region. So this is not certainly going to help. And with people now being discouraged or concerned about traveling, even domestically, we're seeing the numbers come down. So it is a concerning situation. We're hoping that the government authorities will take a strong grip on the situation, and the hope is that we begin to see in the coming months that the number of cases begin to diminish, which we hope will bring more confidence to the traveling public. But we are now facing a very challenging period of time for the country, and the world is taking notice, and as a result is imposing restrictions on this country. So I don't know if Danny, you want to add anything else to that, or if you have any numbers.
No, Peter, not much to complement. You perfectly summarized the current situation here in Brazil. But glad to take any other question from my colleagues here in Brazil.
Okay, I will scan the queue, and if there's any more Brazil specific, I shall pose them. No worries. With that, Peter, I'd like to sort of lead on to a general outlook for Latin America as a whole. I have questions from the various markets, more or less what you've just said also in English for Brazil, but maybe in Spanish for the entire region, sort of, where do we see the recovery going, especially since we've had more and more mutations. We started the year with increased travel restrictions. So, where do we see the sort of the journey going in the next couple of years? And maybe just to start in Spanish, because I think we more or less gave the outlook for Brazil, which is more or less similar for the region in English already.
Okay, so I'll start in Spanish and then I'll in English. Bueno, la situación, lo que habíamos estimado a nivel global y definitivamente incluyendo la región, es que lo que estimábamos es una recuperación internacional alrededor del 2024, es el año 2024, donde esperamos que vamos a volver a las cifras de 2019. Los vuelos domésticos estimamos que podrían volver alrededor de finales de 2022, comienzos de 2023. Algunos países van a estar más avanzados que otros. Los viajeros que vuelven para ver a sus familias o hacer turismo va a ser un sector que va a volver más rápido que los viajeros de negocios. Los viajeros de negocios, el business traveler, va a tardar más tiempo para volver y obtener esa recuperación. Pero mucho de esto también, estas cifras que estamos dando de los años de recuperación, van a depender mucho en el cierre de fronteras, las restricciones, las cuarentenas que tenemos implementados por nuestros países. Estamos viendo que el número de casos en Europa, en América Latina, han ido incrementando, lo que ha obligado a implementar medidas más severas a la hora de poder viajar, tanto a nivel de dejar pasajeros internacionales y llegar a sus países, de la misma manera de poder volar sin cuarentenas o tipo de restricciones. Cuanto más tiempo se mantengan, más tiempo va a ser la recuperación. A finales de este año, del año pasado, 2020, cuando vimos que ya se iba a ver el movimiento de las vacunas, se iban a hacer disponibles a nivel global, veíamos que posiblemente podíamos ver una recuperación que comenzara a principios del primer semestre de este año. Desafortunadamente no ha sido el caso. Las vacunas no se han distribuido con la rapidez y eficiencia que se esperaba, con la excepción de Estados Unidos seguramente y algunos países como Israel y Chile. Segundo, se han impuesto más restricciones, más cierres de fronteras a nivel global, así que lo que está limitando la conectividad internacional. Y eso obviamente va a tener un desgaste a la hora de poder reabrir. Ahora, Una vez que reabremos, como yo había comentado en mis comentarios al comienzo, que la región vuelva a lo que era las cifras o cómo se operaba en el 2019 es simplemente inaceptable. La industria, si vemos previo a la pandemia global, la industria en América Latina llevábamos 4 años de pérdidas. El último año que tuvimos una ganancia como industria en América Latina fue en el 2017 de alrededor de $500 millones. Desde ese momento hasta ahora hemos tenido pérdidas todos los años. Y por esa razón el llamamiento y lo que va a ser nuestra estrategia, que volver al 2019 no es aceptable si esta región, si la industria va a ser competitiva con otras regiones y que nos permita a que la industria pueda crecer, pueda dar más servicios a los pasajeros. Para ello, los gobiernos tienen que tomar un rol muy distinto, tenemos que trabajar de otra manera, se tiene que invertir en infraestructura, tenemos que implementar un régimen de regulaciones, de leyes que proteja a pasajeros, pero a la misma manera permita a la industria operar como una industria liberada, abierta y competitiva. La tercera es la competitividad regional. América Latina es de las regiones más caras que tenemos a nivel de costes y impuestos. Y los gobiernos, incluso en estos momentos de crisis, están aprovechando la situación para imponer tasas a la industria y a los pasajeros y utilizando el branding de COVID como excusa para incrementar los gastos. Y eso tampoco se puede hacer en un momento donde queremos traer confianza, queremos que más pasajeros empiecen a viajar y tengamos más competitividad. Y el último tema es el tema del medio ambiente, la responsabilidad de trabajar conjuntamente con nuestro gobierno. Si logramos con estos 4 pilares, en nuestro punto de vista, vamos a estar en una posición que después del 2024 y para los próximos 20 a 30 años se vea que el transporte aéreo pueda duplicarse en el número de pasajeros que viajen a la región y desde la región. Así que el futuro puede ser muy positivo, tanto y cuando los gobiernos trabajen con la industria, pero de una manera muy distinta a lo que llevamos trabajando. I'll say it very quickly in English, Marcus.
Yeah, sure.
So I had said it just before in terms of the recovery with the 2024 international, end of 2022, beginning of 2023. We hope the domestic, the visiting family and just general leisure traffic is expected to return much quicker than the business traffic into the region. But a lot of our restart, a lot of the recovery in this region, as in other parts of the world, is going to be highly dependent on how quickly we can restart and remove the quarantines, how quickly we can lift the country restrictions or country shutdowns. At the end of 2020, with the announcements of vaccines being made available, we had high hopes that we were going to see the beginning of a recovery in the first quarter of this year. Unfortunately, the distribution of vaccines has not been the most efficient on a global scale. Only a handful of countries like the United States, Israel, Chile have really taken a very proactive approach to make the vaccines available to its citizens. Many other countries are somewhat in the bureaucratic process, and the increase of COVID numbers going up and mutations increasing has required governments to continue to impose restrictions. And again, not something that we're against. We're supporting our governments in that sense, the importance of the health of its citizens and the industry helping to transport the vaccines as quickly as possible. But it's going to be very dependent on how quickly we can restart our industry and remove restrictions and reopen borders. But as I said in my comments, simply accepting returning to 2019, how it was back then, is simply unacceptable for our industry in Latin America. The industry will not be competitive if we default to that. If we look at the years prior to the pandemic, Latin American carriers and the industry in this region were losing money. The last time the industry actually made some money was in 2017, where it made about $500 million. The remaining years up to the pandemic have been in the red. The industry has lost money. We have not been competitive because governments have continuously imposed barriers on the industry. What we need to move forward is to work closer with governments, establish a partnership, but our governments need to ensure that we have the right infrastructure both at the airport and the air transit level. We need to make sure that we have regulatory best practices that are being implemented with fair passenger rights regulations. We need to make the region much more competitive in terms of taxation and charges. This region is some of the highest in the world. And during this time of crisis, when the responsibility and the commitment of government should be how to help the industry, how do you help bring travel and tourism back by reducing fees and making it attractive for passengers. What many governments are actually doing is imposing new taxations and fees, and they're using COVID as an excuse. And that is highly unacceptable during a period of time that they're trying to tax the industry, the passengers, instead of helping the industry maintain connectivity and bring back the passengers to the region. And the last one is on the environmental front. We need to work much closer with governments. Governments need to take the environmental challenges in a much more responsible and aligned manner and coordinated way with the industry. If we're able to successfully implement these 4 pillars with governments, we strongly believe that the forecast to double the number of passengers in our region over the next 20 years from 2024 onwards is a real target that can be achieved, in which the industry will provide social and economic benefits to this region. Only if the governments are able and willing to work with us on these 4 pillars.
Thank you, Peter. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I have a few sort of questions which we can group around the necessity for having vaccination in order to travel. So there was a lot of media coverage recently again on, do airlines need to mandate vaccination or not? And I think we have a very clear stance that it's, in the end, it's the government that needs to do that. And then where are we on travel pass across the region in addition to Copa and Panama? And I think Boris is also on the line to provide additional information if needs be. So I'll just quickly do this in Spanish and then hand over to you for sort of comment on that. Bueno, nos quedan casi 10 minutos y me quedan preguntas con la referencia de vacunas y también de IATA Travel Pass. Y de punto de vista de IATA, ya que han comenzado la vacunación, ¿qué pensamos que de la petición petición, o si sería mandatorio de tener la vacuna para viajar? Y además, si tenemos más información en general sobre Travel Pass y una posible expansión de Travel Pass en otros mercados de América Latina o otras compañías en el mercado.
Bueno, empiezo yo, Marcos, y después lo paso a Boris. Bueno, a nivel de las vacunas, obviamente, como dice Marcos, la responsabilidad está en las manos de los gobiernos en cómo se va a implementar. Lo que tenemos seguro que las vacunas van a jugar un rol muy importante en atraer confianza de vuelta al consumidor, a los viajeros. Lo que sí sabemos es que por lo menos este año va a tener que haber un balance. Algunos países van a estar muy avanzados con pasajeros vacunados y otros no. Y por eso se va a pedimos a los gobiernos que empiecen a implementar protocolos y procedimientos en dando opciones tanto a los pasajeros vacunados como a esos pasajeros que tendrán que tener pruebas negativas para viajar. Pero vemos que va a ser una combinación entre pasajeros vacunados y pasajeros que todavía tienen que usar las pruebas para poder subirse a los aviones. Y lo que sí, el gol final será en un punto que los pasajeros estarán vacunados, que puedan viajar, y eso va a traer más confianza tanto para los gobiernos como para los viajeros. Ya hemos visto algunos países como son Panamá, Ecuador, que ya han anunciado si un pasajero está vacunado no va a requerir una prueba PCR. Y yo creo que ese va a ser el tren, el proceso que van a seguir otros países a nivel regional. I'll just say in English very quickly.
Yeah, sure.
Y después paso a Boris para Travel Pass. In terms of the vaccines, obviously the governments will have to dictate and implement the procedures that we'll be following. But what we're sensing is going to be, at least for the remainder of this year, a balance of passengers that are vaccinated with passengers that have to, that will require some sort of negative PCR test. We're already seeing countries like Ecuador and Panama that have already announced that they are going to accept vaccinated passengers coming into the country without any sort of PCR testing. And this is the right approach in terms of gaining confidence, where you're giving passengers different options in terms of how they can complete their travel experience. If you're vaccinated, then you go down one route. If you have to take have a negative PCR, you go down another route. But for the remainder of the year, we see it's going to have to be a balanced approach. And for that, it's critical that the governments, not only in our region, but on a global scale, implement standardized procedures that are similar to all the countries and around the world. The last thing we want is, again, countries implementing their own regulations that differ from what the global standards are. Boris, con eso te lo paso a ti para que hables un poquito sobre el Travel Pass.
Sí, perfecto. Sí, buenas tardes a todos, buenos días. En relación al Travel Pass, sí, como dijo Peter, creo que hay 18 aerolíneas que están actualmente haciendo las pruebas con Travel Pass. En la región hay varias que están haciendo pruebas, simplemente algunas han salido al público, han sido públicas, como en el caso de Copa, pero otras no han hecho sus esfuerzos públicos, por lo tanto no los podemos compartir. Sin embargo, en cuanto a los públicos, los que ya han salido a los medios a declarar es Copa, Qatar, Emiratos Árabes, Singapore Airlines y otras, ¿no? En cuanto al proceso de Travel Pass, estamos haciendo un outreach program para las aerolíneas y también para los gobiernos. Estamos conversando con varios gobiernos. Entonces, esperamos que en el futuro, pronto van a haber más anuncios en las próximas semanas de otras aerolíneas que se están sumando a la iniciativa. Ahora lo puedo hacer en inglés. In regards to Travel Pass, we have, as Peter mentioned earlier, we have around 18 airlines that are conducting Travel Pass pilots around the world. And these airlines, some of them have gone public, like Copa, Qatar, Emirates, and Etihad, and others, and Singapore Airlines. But others have remained their intentions and their implementations privately, so I cannot disclose those. We are working with other airlines in the region actively who are very advanced in the trials, and we should see new announcements of airlines that will be going public with their trials in the next couple of weeks. And also, we are reaching out to governments in order to have governments engage with the Travel Pass benefits because of the benefits it brings on the encrypted and PCR messaging that we generate that avoids any fake Travel Pass certificates that are flowing around in the region. I think that's about it from my side. If there's any more questions, I'm open.
Ok, gracias, Boris. Creo que hemos contestado a todas las preguntas más o menos. Bueno, una última y después cerramos porque ya bueno, somos casi las 2 de la tarde. Eso se relaciona un poquito a los comentarios, Peter, que hiciste antes sobre la recuperación después del 2024, ¿no? Y si crees que existe la voluntad política en los gobiernos en Latinoamérica para modificar el marco regulatorio y hacerlo más armonizado y flexible, si observamos ya una tendencia sobre este contexto y si ya tenemos, no sé, buenas o malos ejemplos.
Bueno, como lo había mencionado antes, va a ser crítico la involucración de nuestro gobierno a nivel regional para trabajar conjuntamente en un plan común, en un objetivo común. No solo para la recuperación del mercado, la recuperación social y económica de los países, pero para que la región pueda ser competitivo en el futuro con otras regiones. Definitivamente en los primeros años va a ser muy complicado, muy difícil para atraer pasajeros, y por eso es tan importante que a nivel gubernamental seamos aliados en vez de enemigos, como ha sido en el pasado a veces. Y ese va a ser nuestro llamamiento. Sí tengo que decir que durante el COVID nos ha permitido trabajar muy estrechamente con los gobiernos a nivel regional y en todo momento ha sido una colaboración muy abierta. Desde México a Colombia, a Brasil, a Argentina, Chile, no había ni un país que no hemos trabajado de una manera muy colaborativa para el bien del país y del sector. Y ese es el espíritu donde que quisiéramos trabajar en el futuro, donde podemos enfocarnos en los beneficios que pueda traer el transporte aéreo como un componente del turismo y viaje para los gobiernos a nivel económico, pero también para los ciudadanos a nivel social de esos países. Y si logramos que los países de nuestra región implementen o trabajen con nosotros con estos pilares, nos va a permitir ser una industria mucho más fuerte, que pueda dar mejor servicio a los ciudadanos de nuestra región a nivel de mejor conectividad, precios más baratos y un mejor servicio, y obviamente siendo un aliado y socio estratégico económico para los gobiernos de nuestra región. Si logramos esto, yo creo que vamos a tener un futuro bueno y vamos a poder proyectadas durante los próximos 20 años para duplicar el número de pasajeros. I'll say quickly in English, Marcus.
Yeah, I think especially the part where you referred to some of the good cooperation we did have with governments,
yes,
during the crisis. I think that's the part we haven't sort of stressed in English yet, and I think
I will. Yes.
Take your final remarks.
Thank you very much. So, as I was saying in Spanish, obviously moving forward, and if this industry is going to be competitive, if this industry is going to be able to have more connectivity, better service, lower prices, provide more value to the citizens of this region, we need to be a strategic partner with the governments, so we can help them in their endeavors to make life better for their citizens, bring more economic prosperity with more jobs and more connectivity. That has not always been the case in the past, and this is why now is the moment to look towards the future. The forecast, as I mentioned, from 2024 onward is that over the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to see the doubling of passenger traffic in this region. That will only be able to be achieved if we are able to work together with our governments with a common goal in serving the citizens of this region with better connections, bringing more goods, more passengers, more jobs to the region. That has not always been the case. We have to focus on the 4 pillars that I have outlined before. If we're able to do that, we're going to be successful. I will say, as I mentioned in Spanish, that the working relationship with the governments during this crisis has been exceptional. Working with the Mexican government, the governments of Barbados, of Panama, Colombia, Chile, Brazil, Peru, all the countries in this region, those I have mentioned, those I have not mentioned, They have all worked in a very open and collaborative manner with the airline industry, with IATA, and we hope that will continue. If we're able to do that in the same spirit that we have managed the relationship during this crisis, I foresee a very positive and quick recovery for our industry in the future, and I expect that this industry will be able to deliver on the promises of better connectivity, more competitiveness, more service to the citizens of this region, and again, being a strategic ally to our government in bringing both social and economic well-being to Latin America and the Caribbean. But we need to make sure that we're able to work in the same manner and in the same spirit that we have done during this period of time.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for all those who joined us today. And as usual, the copy of the presentation and the link to the recording will be made available by email during the course of the afternoon.